everybody, and welcome to the Esoteric Order of Gamers. My name is Peter and I love tabletop games of all types. Now, since in my last video I talked a lot about rediscovering old games, I thought it was time to kick off my post-holiday series of videos by talking about a classic, something interesting from the past and why I love it. You know, but before we get started, this beard is just a little bit itchy. Can you excuse me for a moment? Oh, that's better. Right, let's get started, shall we? Today I want to talk about an old favourite called Fury of Dracula. Well, I say Fury of Dracula, but it was originally called The Fury of Dracula. Games Workshop brought this out in 1987, and I well remember when it came out. I was very excited about it because it was so incredibly thematic. It's set after the events of Bram Stoker's book, and it has a Dracula trying to escape across Europe while a bunch of hunters pursue him. Now, later on, this was re-released by Games Workshop in 2006, actually, with this edition, just called Fury of Dracula now, and they changed the game quite a lot. I'll tell you all about how they changed it later on. In 2015, they brought out a third edition, Fury of Dracula. This one had a few tweaks, but it was essentially the same game as second edition. And past that, we've had another edition in 2019 by WizKids, which I don't have because I'm very happy with third edition. There's also been a digital edition, which you can find on Steam, unfortunately for Windows only, so I haven't played it because I have a Mac. That was released by Nomad Games in 2020. But let's get started with the granddaddy of them all, The Fury of Dracula, released by Games Workshop in 1987. Now, if you're not aware, Games Workshop released a lot of board games before they started getting on to the classic stuff that they're known for now, the tabletop miniatures games. They were doing board games of this square format box way back in the early 80s. And when this one came out, it's hard to imagine now, from our perspective, how revolutionary it was. Not only was it a hidden movement game, which I'd never come across before, but it was incredibly thematic. Now you've got to remember that Settlers of Catan came out in 1995. So we still had a long way to go before thematic German strategy tabletop games became more and more common. Games Workshop was really ahead of the curve in this respect. Now I remember The Fury of Dracula coming out in 87 and being really excited because, of course, I was a fan of all things horror and sci-fi and fantasy, and it was great to see a game based on the Dracula story. And the great thing about it is that when you play Dracula, you did so from behind this screen. All your movement is hidden from the rest of the players, and you keep track of it on this special board. So, of course, as someone who played a lot of role-playing games back in the day, I immediately related to the idea of being behind a screen while the rest of the players did their stuff and they couldn't see what I was doing. It just seemed like the perfect evolution from role-playing game to board game. I took a great deal of delight playing up the role of Dracula. You'd be behind this board making your little moves, going and trying to scare the other players as much as possible. And the good thing about this version of the game is that Dracula is really scary. Because you're hiding behind this screen and doing hidden movement, there's a real sense of power to being the Dracula player. Now, the other players are playing the three hunters, and they are Lord Godalming, Dr. Seward, and Professor von Helsing. You always have the three hunters. And they are pursuing Dracula across the map of Europe. And as I said, of course, Dracula's movement is hidden, so they don't know where he is. Not only that, Dracula is leaving traps and encounters behind on the board for the hunters to discover. If the hunters go to a location and they search it and they find an encounter, they may be up for battling something like rats or bats or Zagani or even other vampires. However, if they don't have an encounter, they get a chance to collect items and special things that can help them in their fight against Dracula. And the amount they get depends on the size of the town that they're in. There are things like dogs and steaks and holy water and garlic and all the classic stuff you need to fight the Dark Prince. Not only can they get items and weapons to help them, but there are also these encounter cards. The only problem with drawing these encounter cards is that if you draw one from the bottom of the deck, you may find yourself drawing one of the ones with a bat on it. And if you do, you have to give that card to Dracula and he could use it against you. So there's this wonderful sense of tension every time you go for an encounter card. Is it going to be one that's going to help you in your battle, or is it going to help your opponent? And these cards can be pretty powerful. There's some very useful stuff in it. The most powerful of them all is newspaper reports, which basically reveals Dracula's current position on the board to all the hunters. So Dracula is terrified of this one. However, if Dracula happens to have sensationalist press, he can indicate 2 locations on the board, only one of which has to be the real location. The most terrifying card of all for the hunters, and one of the reasons why you probably want to avoid drawing encounter cards when you feel like your net is closing in and you're about to find Dracula, is the dreaded evasion. Now, if Dracula gets this card, he can immediately move from where he is, even from a C sector, to any town on the board in secret. So that's pretty devastating, and you have to be careful that you don't draw that card later on in the game. I've played at least one game where the hunters spent a long time narrowing down their search and they'd almost found Dracula, and then they decided to draw an encounter card and Dracula got that card and went off somewhere they knew not where. And this really discouraged the players. In fact, in that particular game, they all gave up on the game and they'd had enough. Because it can be very frustrating spending all that time trying to find Dracula and then just knowing that he's escaped your clutches and he could be anywhere. Now, the fact that Dracula has to be quite careful in where he moves around the board means that this game definitely does benefit if the Dracula player knows what he or she is doing. There is a certain element of that role-playing in playing Dracula. It's fun to not only play up the role of the villain, but also if you know what you're doing and you can make sure you evade the hunters for the right amount of time, it can be really, really satisfying to lead them on wild goose chases. However, luck is always a big factor. It's very possible to find yourself hemmed in by the hunters just by pure luck right at the start and find yourself getting off flat-footed. Now, when the hunters do encounter Dracula's minions or even Dracula himself, you use this combat board. Now, if you're fighting Dracula, you start by rolling on the daytime chart, and there's a 50-50 chance it's daytime or nighttime. This can make a huge difference to the battle if you're fighting Dracula, because he's much more powerful in the night. But whoever you're fighting, you basically lay down combat chits on either side, and then you cross-index them on the table to get the result. So the combat is quite thematic as well, because you're doing particular things. Your hunter may be attacking Dracula with a stake, but he may dissipate into a fog and escape. Dracula may go for the classic bite, but you may be able to dodge at just the last moment. There's a real sense of theme to the combat. Finally, the game shows its age a little bit by having a whole set of victory conditions, major and minor ones, depending what happens. Dracula has a certain number of blood points, and when he gets down to 0 blood points, he has to flee back to Castle Dracula. And from that point on, he can't actually win the game. However, you can try and change the graduations of victory depending on how many of his vampires you kill and whether you kill Dracula himself. Similarly, Dracula can win in different ways depending on how many vampires he has placed on the board and how many of the hunters he's bitten or killed. I've had some great times playing the Fury of Dracula. I remember particularly we got together one Halloween night and made the game very, very atmospheric with all the right lighting and some candles and stuff like that. It's a very, very cool game. Yes, it shows its age a little bit with the sort of random highs and lows, but I just think there's this real sense of Dracula being quite a nasty villain, and if you have the right person playing Dracula, it can be particularly enjoyable. I managed to grab the original limited edition with metal miniatures, but it came with plastic miniatures after that. And as I said, this will always be a treasured part of my collection. So I extolled the virtues of the Fury of Dracula for a long time, but it took a long, long time for someone to grab it and reprint it. It didn't happen until 2006, 19 years later. Fantasy Flight Games got a license to do a lot of Games Workshop games, and they took the opportunity to re-release some of these old classics. So at last we saw the Fury of Dracula again, this time called just Fury of Dracula. And Fantasy Flight certainly made a lot of changes to Fury of Dracula, most of which were very clever and well considered, but had the inevitable effect of changing the atmosphere of the game somewhat. The first thing you'll notice is that I'm not hiding behind a screen. Dracula no longer does his movement in secret. Instead, he has a trail of cards. So I've got this set of cards here, which corresponds to all the locations on the board, including C locations. And when I travel from location to location, I put down one of these cards matching the location I'm going to, and I move my cards along this trail. And so there is a trail that the hunters are trying to follow. Now this takes out some of the random hide and seek element of the first game, and instead makes the game somewhat more deductive, because as these locations are revealed, and they'll have encounters on them as well, Dracula has a whole lot of encounter chits that he can place on the location cards. As hunters find these, they get an idea of where Dracula is, and they can hone in on his location, which is great from the hunter's point of view. It makes it a more deductive game, but it also takes away some of the scariness of Dracula and the power of Dracula. The game becomes a bit more of a chasing Dracula than being terrified of Dracula. Quite a few other things have changed as well. There's no longer a random roll at the start of combat turns. In fact, there's a time tracker here that goes from dawn, noon, dusk, twilight, midnight and small hours, and then goes through to a new day. You can time your combats more carefully so you can make sure you don't get into a combat with Dracula during the night if you manage to time that. So this adds another layer of strategy to the game. And every time it comes through to a new day, Dracula's vampire track advances. He's going to win the game if he gets to 6 vampires. So now there's a timing element to the game as well. There's a countdown. He can also get extra points on the vampire track by killing hunters and also by maturing vampires. Now, maturing is a new concept as well. And that means when a card comes off the end of this track here, the card is matured. And depending on the card, it may have some special effects. If it's a vampire card, it comes off the board and you get +2 on the vampire track. So now Dracula's trying to hide a vampire in a particular location long enough so it can come off the track and he can get those extra points towards the win. Dracula can also reinforce locations by taking cards when they come off the track and putting them in the catacombs, and then they get reinforced with an extra encounter chit, so they become particularly powerful. You still have the encounter deck and you still draw cards off the bottom of the deck, so you may be giving them to Dracula. But there's also a resolve track for the hunters, and they can trade in these points for getting particular encounter card effects, like newspaper reports, which allows them to discover where Dracula is. One thing I forgot to mention is that there's an extra hunter, Mina Harker. Now, the Mina Harker character was originally a fan-made expansion to the original game, and Fantasy Flight took the idea and ran with it, hopefully compensated the person who came up with it, and added Mina Harker to the game. And the twist with Mina is that she's already bitten at the start of the game, so Dracula can leverage that power to get some special abilities, but also the hunters can use the fact that she's bitten to help track down Dracula, which gives a nice thematic link to the original book. So you can see things change quite a lot from first edition to second edition. And for my money, I like this new idea of the cards and everything, but it does have a price, and that is the fact that, well, for a start, you can't revisit locations that are in the trail, which feels a bit thematically off. And also, as I mentioned, we've changed the atmosphere here a little bit, and Dracula doesn't feel like as much as a threat. It's not as random as the first game, which is good, and it involves more deduction for the hunters, which is good, but Dracula is kind of running from the hunters more, which isn't as good. As you can see, however, the production is gorgeous, and they've really captured the Victoriana atmosphere really well. It's really nice, and not only that, strangely, it had a plastic insert, which is something you very, very rarely saw from Fantasy Flight. And it's the only red plastic insert I ever saw from Fantasy Flight. This edition, and indeed the next edition, also came with these lovely new plastic miniatures. So this was the edition of Fury of Dracula we had for another 9 years. In 2015, the third edition came out, and for my money, it's probably the best of the lot. And here it is, the absolutely gorgeous third edition. Now, apart from the fact that there was some annoyance at the fact that Dracula looked a little bit like a cackling Liberace on the cover, but this cover has really grown on me. I really like it now. Everyone was very impressed with this edition, and it looks beautiful. The board is much larger, and the artwork and graphic design throughout is vastly improved. Still using the same plastic miniatures, but they were great from the last edition, so no need to change those. Quite a few gameplay changes here, but they tend to be ones that are more along the lines of streamlining and cleaning up some of the rules bloat that went into that last edition when they were tacking a lot of things onto the formula. And the differences here really make for a more streamlined and sleeker game. We've got an influence track now instead of a vampire track. If Dracula reaches 13 on the influence track, he wins the game, but he still gets influenced by doing things like maturing vampires and letting time tick on. And now you've got a time track which is divided into dawn and dusk. And as it goes around the track, every time you do a full loop of this track, you add one of these despair markers. And these are new. There are 3 of these. When you put these down, Dracula gets a rumour token, which I'll talk about in a moment, and the end of the game approaches. So, a few other changes as well. Now, the hunters get 2 goes. They get a day and a night phase, and then followed by the Dracula phase, which is in the night. We still have the trail. Encountered shits have become cards, so you put cards down on top of the other cards. And as I said, Dracula can get new things called rumour tokens. If he manages to mature a vampire off the trail with a rumour token on it, he's going to get a +3 influence, so they're very much worth doing. However, they can also indicate to the hunters which locations have vampires in them. But Dracula might be bluffing, so you never know. Another thing that's been simplified and streamlined in this game is the combat system. There's some lovely combat cards, all nicely illustrated, and they use an icon system now. Now, in the last version, I probably didn't go into detail about that, but they changed things a little bit with dice roll system. Now it's back to a sort of comparing icons and seeing how they react to each other kind of system. It's much better and much faster, and it still retains that thematic feel. If you sat me down and said, let's play Fury of Dracula, this is the edition I would play. Now, I haven't played the new one by WizKids, but I don't think there are too many changes. If I wanted a completely different play experience where it's more random and Dracula is a bit more scary and unpredictable, then I'd go back to the original edition for the nostalgia feel. But really, this for me is the definitive version of the game. Well, there you have it, folks. Fury of Dracula. I'm very, very attached to my original 1987 edition with its metal miniatures. It's one of the special items in my collection, and I'm never going to part with it. Wonderful memories from this game. I hope you've enjoyed this look at an old favourite from the past. I'm going to try and do more of these kind of videos. If you enjoy them, let me know. Of course, don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Sign up to my Discord channel if you want to be part of the community of the Esoteric Order of Gamers. I'm not paying as much attention to social media these days because there's so many of them. So if you want to chat with like-minded gamers and find out all the behind-the-scenes stuff about the Esoteric Order of Gamers, join the Discord channel. Just go along to orderofgamers.com and sign up, and I'll see you there. In the meantime, good gaming. Bye for now.